Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mikołaj Pisarski. I am president of the Mises Institute of Economic Education from Poland, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all on today's session titled The Changes After Socialism in a Comparative Perspective. And today, our keynote will be the greatest expert on the subject, the author of the Polish Transformation after 1989, Professor Leszek Balcerowicz. He is a former deputy prime minister and a minister of finance in the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe after the Second World War, a former chairman of the National Bank of Poland, laureate of the 2014 Milton Friedman Award for Advancement of Liberty, among many other distinguished honors and prizes. As he himself says in his autobiographical interview, "You should know how to fight." And he sure does, which not only he demonstrated while leading the free market transformation of the Polish economy in the 90s, but also that he and his team in his think tank that he founded in 2007, the Civil Development Forum, demonstrate today, while they remain on the first line of fight to uphold the rule of law and the principles of classical liberalism in increasingly authoritarian Poland. Our session today will proceed as follows. First, Professor Balcerowicz will deliver 15-minute opening remarks, and later he will be interviewed by our three panelists, Adrián Ravier of ESEADE, Guillermo Covernton of Catholic University, and Constanza Mazzina of ESEADE. Should time allow it, we will also take questions from the audience at the end of the session. And without further ado, Professor Balcerowicz.
Okay, thank you very much for such a generous introduction. I will try to keep my 15 minutes using the presentation, and we can start using it. I'm here. No, next. Okay, now in my professional and academic life, I've been dealing with monetary and fiscal problems, but first of all, I was dealing with institutional issues, and they are the most important, because there are good and bad systems, and one has to know for sure which is good, which is bad, and then if opportunity arises, to move from bad to a better one. Now, I've been using a very simple presentation of various types of the systems. As you can see, you have 5 institutional dimensions. Here, democracy, civil rights, rule of law, economic freedom, and you have several types of institutional systems, starting from socialism through quasi-socialism, more or less free market capitalism, crony capitalism, etc., etc. There is not exhaustive. There should be a special place for Argentina's systems over time, but this I leave to the discussion. Let me start with a system which was very bad and lasted for 70 or 80 years, starting in Russia, which was socialism. This points out that the best system can last. Why? Because they are based on fear. The most important issue of socialism was abolition of economic freedom, meaning the replacement of private ownership by a monopoly of the state one and of markets by central planning. And this has produced 2 effects. First, over time, a very bad economic performance. To be sure, there were some Western economists who thought that socialists can work as good as free market capitalists, and they included Schumpeter and Samuelson. So mainstream economics is full of fallacies. But in fact, and some other people have foreseen that, once you abolish economic freedom, then you are bound to have increasingly bad economic performance, which cannot be combined with democracy, because it could be combined only if people would persistently vote from abolition of economic freedom, and this is unrealistic. As a result, socialism cannot be combined with civil rights and rule of law, and with democracy, meaning free elections, free and honest elections. And this was the fact. But remember, there was a huge illusion about socialism because there are many anti-capitalists in the world. new generation of anti-capitalists arrived on the scene, and the need to fight them through better communication would never disappear. Now, very briefly, what I mean by quasi-socialism, for example, Belarus. You see what is going in Belarus. It was almost socialist in a sense that private sector was allowed in a limited dose, but most of the economy consisted of state sector controlled politically. And again, it could not function much better from the economic point of view, and it could only be dictatorship. Many people wonder why many Arab countries perform very badly economically, and some of them mean it is because of Islam. I don't think so. They perform very badly because they are quasi-socialist and very limited markets. Now, there are many varieties of what is called capitalism in the sense of a system which is based on private ownership, because there are many differences. And I think, empirically speaking, from the economic and non-economic point of view, the best variety of capitalism is free market capitalism, which by definition can coexist only with a limited state, fiscally limited from the point of view of the creation of legal norms and of limitations of economic freedom. And such a system can exist as long as there's enough well-organized people who keep it in check. So the maintaining extensive economic freedom, even though it produces good economic results, is possible only if anti-capitalism, which exists even in best functioning market economies, meet sufficiently strong resistance. So defense of economic freedom would never disappear. And this is very good because we are going to have a guaranteed job. People who like and believe, empirically speaking, economic freedom. Now, what we have in the West are very few countries which are close, not completely identical to economic freedom. For example, I think the closest one will be Ireland, Hong Kong, until it's been taken over by mainland China. Most of the countries of the West fall into category of over-regulated, especially labor markets, or fiscally unstable countries. They are still better, of course, than socialists, but if you see the problems in any Western economies, it is not because of free markets, but because of bad state intervention, and most state interventions are very bad. This has been explained by public choice literature, by some Austrian economists. And as I said, the only solution for that is to fight for economic freedom, so be effective in communication and in unmasking various anti-capitalistic, anti-liberal fallacies. A very bad kind of economy which is not socialist is a crony capitalism, as it originated in Russia. Why it is very bad? First, because it is unjust. So you have a privileged group of businessmen who can use the state institutions to capture their competitors. And because of that, it's also ineffective. So crony capitalism is a very bad system, perhaps economically a little better than socialism, but not to be recommended. Now, you can add to that some other types, but I think this captures the main varieties of systems in the West. And if you have a very bad system, then it is a great event when it collapses. Which brings me to what has happened after the collapse of socialism. It was unexpected. Collapse of bad systems is usually unexpected, like epidemics, unexpected. But you have to work to be prepared. So coming to Poland, I have a hobby. As a young person, I was interested in reforms. In the 80s, I worked with a group of people, and we started as a hobby such fundamental issues like property rights, protectionism, fiscal problems, monetary problems. As a hobby, we never dreamt that this would be useful during our life. But all of a sudden, there was a collapse of socialism, first in Poland and in other countries. And since there were not many people who were working on a program for a free Poland, for the lack of competition, I was asked to be in charge of Poland's economic transformation. Now, very briefly, if you have more questions about that, I would be very happy to respond to these questions. How much time do I have still?
7 minutes.
Oh, 7 minutes, plenty of time. So we move to the next. This is illustration how costly was socialism in every case compared to a relatively efficient market economy. And there is no good socialism in the world. There was never in history. Which should puzzle people who know how popular has been socialism. Extremely popular, especially among intellectuals. Not only in Russia, but also in the West. Now, socialism was popular among some intellectuals, but was not popular in the population. Now, once socialism was abandoned or collapsed, there was a fundamental question: what to do next? On political front, initially, all the countries moved to free elections. Not every country has maintained free elections, but they moved. More or less, Central Europe has stuck to free elections, with some exceptions like Hungary and Poland. But we have to regain this. So on economic front, there was usually nonsensical discussion under the heading shock therapy versus gradualism. It was nonsensical because shock was frightening people, and gradualism is something which is very vague. What does it mean? I never use that. Now, in my strategy, first I assumed that the most important thing economically for Poland is to catch up. And this depends on the target system, what we want to introduce. And here, my hobby and my work with my colleagues helped me, because it was not much doubt that the system which ensures fast and sustained economic growth should be mostly free enterprise, lots of competition, including foreign competition, so no protectionism, relatively moderate spending impossible, and simple taxes, good justice system. So these were some fundamentals, and this was a guiding post. The most important and more difficult questions were not what we want to achieve, but how. Transition is always more complicated, intellectually, but also mostly politically, that indicated the target system. But on transition, there was one question: how fast and how comprehensive? And based on my previous studies in the group and individual, I have no doubt that the fastest possible and comprehensive transition, so very rapid, is the best one, even though it is risky. But slow transition or fragmented transition was perceived by us as hopeless. So remember, a risky option is always better than a hopeless option. So this was also based on the experience of previous reforms. So target system was clear, more or less. And then a transition strategy that's fast and comprehensive and not slow, it's grudging. And we try to stick to the strategy, of course, with some deviations. But after experience of 30 years, there is no doubt that countries which followed radical transition, like Poland, but also later, even more radically by the Baltic countries, have achieved much better economic results than those who follow alternative strategies, like delays or slowness or fragmented, etc. There is no country among the socialist countries, which have followed this alternative strategy, which has not suffered. For example, Poland has more or less the same per capita income in 89 like Belarus or Ukraine. But for various reasons, these two countries have fallen, have suffered as compared to economic growth of Poland. Now, to maintain the fast transition, initially it was not very difficult, because there was a period when people usually expected radical change. But later it was more difficult because there was more and more politicians who came to the conclusion that contesting radical transition is useful for them in terms of support. And in the next stage, what is important even more than in the first stage, you have to be very effective in communication, mobilizing people. I would end with comparing two periods in which I had the same function, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance. The first period, the romantic or heroic, was between September 89 and December 91. We started under catastrophic conditions and we moved very fast. Of course, many problems remained, but we lowered inflation. And first of all, we allowed the private sector to grow under the conditions of competition. That's extremely important. Allow private sector to grow under the conditions of increasing competition. And there was not much need for persuasion, etc. There was need to move as fast as possible. Because this period, which I called of extraordinary politics, can last only for 1 year, 2 years at the most. But I was acting in a second period under completely different conditions of normal politics, means lots of parties. I was then a chairman of a free market party at a junior party with a conglomerate of various right parties plus the trade union solidarity. And in this exotic coalition, we have pushed up very important reforms. Privatization of the banking sector, of metallurgy, etc. Pension reform, fundamental pension, which was later reversed. Then very comprehensive restructure of mining. We have extracted more than 100,000 miners from the mines. And these mines were very inefficient. So extracting miners from inefficient mines is very productive. We have to change it. But how was it possible? Of course, it required a lot of fight within the coalition. I was the main fighter then also, but also a lot of communication. And I collected a team of younger people who were usually faster than older people, and they were very good in communication. And this helped very much in a very different political conditions to push up some fundamental reforms. So I would end with this note.
Thank you, Professor, for the great opening remarks. And now we have three great scholars on the panel who will proceed to interview Professor Balcerowicz on the details of the process of the transformation. First question will come from Adrián Ravier of ESEADE. Please, Adrián.
Well, thank you and congratulations, Leszek, for your presentation. My question is about your visit to Argentina. What do you think? What do you find in Argentina? What do you think about the government of Mauricio Macri? And why do you think that a country as Argentina, or even North Korea, or Cuba, or several countries like Venezuela, do not accept to change their economies to a free economy, or a free market economy? When we see theoretically and empirically a lot of evidence that shows that we are going to be better if we have a free economy.
I understand there are two questions. The first question, it was my second time in Argentina after a long break. This was the meeting of so-called G30 group, which was created by Paul Volcker legendary central banker, and groups, former central bankers like myself, or active central bankers, and some economists. And very strangely, because this was 2 years ago, I think, and we invited a year before by President Macri, who was then supposedly quite successful. But when we arrived, it was just a crisis. We were supposed to meet him, but he was so busy that we have not met him. So we were participating in the meeting, which was supposed to honor reforms in Argentina, and then the crisis. I have not studied in a great detail the policies of the former president. I can only say that my impressions from what I have read before was that he was too slow. So his assessment of risk turned out probably to be wrong. I'm not saying that he was because of his personality. Probably he was a political calculation that it was better to move slower than, and probably he underestimated the risk of what? Of a crisis. And once you have a crisis, you are finished politically. Especially if you promise end to the crisis. So I think in the case of reforms, what is really very, very important is the risk assessment. I understand once you have a reformer wants genuinely to improve the economic situation of the country, but then he has to be correct on calculus. And there are some people who think that moving fast, being radical is more risky than moving slowly. But under some situations, say, if you put down fire, to move slowly is very risky compared to move very fast. Okay, so much on my impressions. On the second point, I think Argentina is very different from North Korea or Cuba, because in Cuba and North Korea, it is just based on naked force, repression, and killing opponents. And there is, as long as this terror machinery will be intact, you can't have change. And the change, because people who are not armed cannot abolish tyranny which is armed. Physically. So what can be a solution which you cannot devise? Something which has happened unless a war from outside, and then the collapse of the regime. I remember Falklands and the junta, or something happens in this black box of dictatorship, but you can never know. So this is a very, very difficult situation. I don't think we have such a issue because I understand that the regime is not based on the naked use of force, but on perhaps unhappy balance of populists versus liberals, which can be improved. Because you are not frightened by the Peronistas. That my understanding would be there are still too many people who believe in fables or in anti-capitalistic propaganda, etc. So in this situation, the solution is to be more effective in communication. And for me, communication includes skillful, truthful, but very strong demystification of populist policies. So communication fight. So I congratulate you on being of such a numerous gathering. And obviously, sorry for saying such an obvious thing, modern communication includes using social media.
To confirm the truth of what Professor just said, just recently in the Polish Facebook, there began a group of fans of the tweets that Professor sets out, and I know that many of them are watching us today, so hello guys. Oh, yeah. And we will proceed to next question from Guillermo Covernton of Catholic University.
Well, first of all, I would like to express that it's a privilege for me to share this panel discussion with Balcerowicz, the great reformer of the Polish economy.
Thank you.
Well, economic development has been my research program for 35 years. And our guest today can teach us a lot. Thank you a lot for this. Yes, thank you very much. But I do not think it is appropriate to ask specific questions. Just highlight the aspects of the policies that you applied in Poland so successfully, which may be of interest for the reconstruction of our Latin American economy. Specifically, I think that it may be of great interest if you tell us about deregulate and liberalize prices, tariffs, and trade as a way to achieve a better allocation of resources, but always scarce. And how to apply shock policies, generating at the same time the necessary political consensus that a democratic society requires. Well, also the importance of balance in the fiscal budget and the elimination of inflation. That seems to have brought the Polish currency into a remarkably stable exchange rate with both the US dollar and the euro. We know that Dr. Balcerowicz governed the Central Bank of Poland from 2001 to 2007, when the stability of the zloty was not the historical tradition. You can also give us your position clearly against allowing government borrowing as a tool of irresponsible populist policies. I would be very satisfied if Dr. Balcerowicz could explain just one of these interesting economic and financial matters today.
Thank you for the question, Professor Balcerowicz.
I'm not completely sure that I grasped all the questions, but was very restrictive. Now the third one, if the question refers to the current discussion about the public debt, for a moment, and I think we have a lot of fallacies and misinformation, because according to some economists, including some reputed economists like Blanchard, public debt is a solution. And this is a disregard, growing public debt. I am not speaking about not having a public debt. It's not a problem like in Estonia, you have 20% of GDP. There's a problem when you have higher levels and if that is growing. And we have a huge fallacies propagated by mainstream economists as though growing and high public debt is not a danger because they assume that interest rates would remain to be very low and that it would not be very costly. But first, you can't know, even the United States cannot know, for how long interest rates are going to be very low. Second, such a very low interest rates produce a damage to the supply side. Because if politicians can borrow at very cheaply, why should they reform the economies? Reform the economies means that you have to face some protests. And most politicians try to avoid the protests. And they can avoid it if they can borrow cheaply. The third, which is well documented, once you have a very low interest rates like in the Western countries, it pays for the banks to lend to so-called zombie companies, so inefficient companies, which would be eliminated on the higher interest rates, which distorts the structure of the economy. And these issues are not very much discussed. And finally, if you expand spending because it is financed by cheap borrowing, what kind of spending do you get? Are you going to believe in the orthodox Keynesianism that public spending is also always very good? This is a fable. This is an illusion. If you compare this to the experience of real world, or to what Buchanan and other economists have written about the behavior of the government. If you can cheaply finance spending, then spending risks to be very ineffective, because then you can cheaply subsidize inefficient enterprises to the detriment of economic growth. You can bail out various private and public companies, and you can increase social spending, and in this way reduce incentives to work. So a fundamental thing which is, I think, forgotten under the influence of post-Keynesian propaganda is the spending is bad. Public spending, because of its structure, tends to be bad, damaging the supply side. And once you recognize this, that you would not encourage people to incur a higher public debt.
Thank you, Professor. So we've taken 2 questions from Adrián, 3 from Guillermo, and now it's Constanza Mazzina of ESEAD. Please, Constanza.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. You have talked about the institutional framework that make economic growth and economic change possible. As a political scientist, I am concerned about democracy and its relation with economic growth. But now it's beyond that democracy faces global challenges. The number of liberal democracies, as you saw in the index that were in your presentation, has declined in the past 10 years. Freedom of expression and the media are the areas are under the most severe attack by governments. In Poland, democratic erosion has mainly affected the media environment, the rule of law, and the judicial constraints on the executive power. So, do you consider Poland as a case of democratic erosion now? Beyond economic achievements, how can this democratic deterioration can be explained? What has not worked or what has changed since you started the reforms? Or finally, do you think the program that you implemented is now transforming or has been abandoned, changing to some kind of populism, or is Polish under another transformation to crony capitalism or overregulating capitalism? In any case, despite the economic improvements that you told us, how can the democratic erosion in Poland can be explained?
Very important questions. I have written some essays on bad transitions or authoritarian transitions, which I'm very happy to send you. Now, well, let me try to respond to your important questions. We have a deterioration of the quality of democratic debate, even in advanced countries. Look at the United States. But what is happening in some less advanced countries is worse. And they call it bad transition after free elections. Now we have 3 types of cases. First, when this bad transition is finished, meaning that it's impossible for the opposition to win elections because they are fake elections or dishonest elections, etc. This is the case of Putin, probably of Erdogan in Turkey, and until at least now on Lukashenko in Belarus. Remember, he has won genuinely free elections in 1994, and these were the last free elections. This is one case. The second case is when that transition started after free elections, but was democratically reversed. And this happened in Macedonia. The strong man who tried to abolish democracy now has a refuge in Budapest, which has a beauty. But he lost elections. And the third case is that the outcome is not yet finished, and this is Poland, meaning that reversal of bad transition is possible and depends, first of all, on organization and communication skills of opposition. But let me first explain how was it possible and how it is possible in some other countries for authoritarian groups to win elections and then to try to perpetuate themselves in power. In the case of Poland, it was like that. We have presidential elections in 2015, and later we have parliamentary elections. And in the presidential elections, it seemed that previous president, a decent democratic guy, is absolutely sure to win this election. And he lost. Why? Because he had a very bad campaign. In mass democracy, it's not enough that you have a better program. You have to have a better campaign. And he had a very bad campaign or non-existent campaign. And as a result, a much worse guy with the present president has won elections. And since he represented his party, and he was very faithful to his party, this has fueled support in the parliamentary elections, so that we have a majority of what is called law and justice, slight majority, a coalition. What has helped them too was that two parties barely missed the threshold because they has not formed a coalition. They have, you know what is bad for a country? But bad guys have good luck. And this has happened in Poland. And they have a good luck afterwards too. Because economy accelerated, not because they have a very good economic policy, they have a very bad economic policy, but there was an acceleration of economic growth in European Union. Besides, because of some problems in Ukraine, many people, the number of Ukrainians working in Poland has doubled, and this has strengthened the economy. In every country, when economy is improving, many people think that those who govern are okay, because many people are not bothered about things which seem to be too sophisticated, rule of law, judges, etc. So certainly this has helped. Now, despite that, and that has maintained the support with the booming economy until recently. Now there's a next chapter, what would be the support for the opposition versus the ruling party. And this would depend not only on what is going to Poland because of coronavirus, this would depend very much on, again, efficiency of the opposition, meaning communication, mobilization, etc. This, to put it in mind, the opposition in Poland has a huge reserves because they are better organized, but they can improve. And even with the fact that they were not very efficient so far, they have gained the Senate, when 2 years ago the elections, and during presidential elections, if these elections were honest, which were not, the incumbent president would have lost. Why they were not honest? Because there was a huge and drastic and disgusting propaganda by the public media, especially TV, which were financed very largely from the budget. So much for the explanation why it happened, and I think with a better organization, better communication,
Thank you,
democracy
Professor.
in Poland, opposition can win elections, even though there's no guarantee.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Constanza, for your question. And since the time for our session is nearing to closure, let's ask one question from the audience. So it's from the audience. Professor, will people only realize of the benefits of a free market economy when a crisis arrives? Is there a need for that to happen so a change can take place before?
Now, there are two categories. If people realize that the crisis is due to bad system and bad policies, then they would support change, like in Poland in '89. There were not many people who would believe in socialism in the economy. But if people believe that the crisis is due to free market reforms, then they would support populism status. And my impression when I was looking at Argentina was that there was a series of genuine free market reforms under Caballo and Menem, but there were some gaps in the reforms or errors. And when the crisis struck in Argentina, when it was 2000, 2001, many people blamed the reforms on the crisis and not insufficient reforms. So conclusions which are drawn from the crisis very much depend on the popular interpretation of the reasons for the crisis, on situational factors, but also on the capacity, abilities of proponents of the free markets to be effective in explaining and in competing populist interpretations.
Thank you. And allow me to move to a closure of our panel with a question of my own. Since we see it in Poland that even the best transformations can fall prey to a populist authoritarian government, and that's what I believe is happening in Poland. So with that knowledge that you have today, what would be your advice on how to safeguard our institutions and how to safeguard these gains that we make during a transformation so that no populist government, no authoritarian government can dismantle it as it's happening here and in many other places around the world?
There are no ultimately effective institutional safeguards. Look what's happened to the legacy of Mrs. Thatcher in Britain. Gradual erosion, and on the part of conservatives. The absolutely necessary safeguard is a very effective organization of people who believe in freedom and the rule of law, so that they can unmask anti-liberal propaganda. Don't believe in a miracles in institutions. Of course, there may be some to make more difficult and to reverse good reforms, but ultimately depends on organizations and communication skills of liberals, classical liberals.
Thank you very much, Professor. And with the numbers of people viewing and listening to our panel, I believe that this society and numbers of people who believe in those principles can make us all feel optimistic. Thank you, Professor Leszek Balcerowicz. Thank you, Guillermo Covernton, Constanza Mazzina, and Adrián Ravier for interviewing on the panel. And before we finish, let me just remind you that the conference will resume at the 3 p.m. of Argentina time. I hope that you will all tune in for the next panels. Thank you very much.